Hello, everybody. Welcome. I know people are still coming in. I'm Stephen Pitty. I'm professor of history, American studies, and ethnicity, race, and migration here at Yale. And I direct the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. I want to thank my colleagues in RITM, Victoria, Mary, and Nicole, for helping to put this together today. Really excited to have all of you here. I learned a long time ago that one wants to listen to everything that Laura Briggs says and read everything that Laura Briggs writes about many of the critical topics facing the world right now, ranging from transnational feminist movements to the politics of reproduction, intersections of empire and migration, the welfare state, the health and safety of children, the past and future of neoliberal governance, and much, much more. She's just one of the most thoughtful, most persuasive, and most well-informed people you'll ever meet. Professor Briggs is professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She earned her PhD in American Studies from Brown University. She's authored a number of field-changing and prize-winning books, including Reproducing Empire, Race, Sex, and U.S. Imperialism in Puerto Rico, International Adoption, Global Inequalities and the Circulation of Children, How All Politics Became Reproductive Politics, From Welfare Reform to Foreclosure to Trump, and Taking Children, A History of American Terror. And she's co-edited important volumes, including Somebody's Children, The Politics of Transnational and Transracial Adoption, and a special issue of Meridians on Radical Transnationalisms, Reimagining Solidarities, Violence, Empires. She's now working on a book entitled The Future is Born in Small Places, The Gendered Biopolitics of Freedom, Debt, Imperialism, and a Natural Disaster in the Caribbean. We'll have to have you back when that book's when Yale's RITM Center considered who we'd like to invite to deliver our fall 2022 lecture, we knew right away that person was Laura Briggs. An outstanding scholar and a great teacher. She's an active series editor at the University of California Press, a program builder who's worked on the organizing collectives of the Tepoztlan Institute for Transnational History and the Thinking Transnational Feminism Summer Institute, and in the Migration Scholars Collective. And she's been an unceasing and wise contributor to public conversations through her appearances on radio, television, and podcasts, and in the print media. Her talk today is entitled Taking Children as a Tactic of Terror, Producing Neoliberalism and Making a Crisis of Immigration and Asylum. Thank you so much for coming, Laura Briggs.
Thank you, Stephen, for that lovely introduction. I have to tell you all, as I was driving down here, I was listening to an audiobook. I was listening to Celeste Ng's Our Missing Hearts, which is about lost children. And it's about the fight to even be able to tell the stories of lost children. So it was quite a fitting thing to be doing as I was trying to get ready for this talk. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to do just that. So in April and May of 2018, the Trump administration's policy of separating children from parents, mostly from Central America, seeking asylum in the United States, made headlines. Photos of children torn from their parents' arms filled the media in the United States. An audio tape of separated children in a shelter crying seemed to be everywhere. Calling the policy zero tolerance, then U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions and Homeland Security Chief Kirstjen Nielsen said they were trying to deter people from petitioning for asylum. In the face of massive protests and a court order to reunite parents and children, the Trump administration walked the policy back and announced they would no longer do it. 9 months later, though, children dying in Customs and Border Protection custody and a flu epidemic in a detention camp in Texas brought doctors and lawyers, then lawmakers and activists, to the camps. Border Patrol was, in fact, still separating children from parents, more than 5,000 of them in total. They were holding them for weeks and months without beds, blankets, showers, or change of clothes at processing stations designed to hold adults for less than 48 hours. One doctor described the squalid conditions of where children were being held as tantamount to the intentional spread of disease, calling them torture facilities. Until the Trump administration figured out how to use the pandemic and public health laws to exclude asylum seekers, Customs and Border Protection deliberately targeted parents and children, separating them at the border as part of a policy meant to deter asylum seekers from entering the country. The cruelty was the point, as Adam Sewer at The Atlantic first said. A widely circulated photo of a father and his toddler daughter floating dead in the Rio Grande suggested the terror that asylum seekers faced while being metered in Mexico for weeks and months, unable to cross the border and petition for asylum, and then forcing them into refugee camps on the U.S.-Mexico border like this one. There's a great deal to criticize in the Biden administration's response to the asylum crisis, especially from Latin America. With a record low number of immigrants and refugees admitted to the U.S., excepting the 2 years of the pandemic. And what I want you to see on this slide is that the ceiling for refugees has been set quite high, but the actual number of refugees admitted is way down in that yellow-orange line. Until this month, the Biden administration had begun to empty refugee camps of mostly Central American migrants in Mexico, like the one from the previous slide in Matamoros, camps that at their height contained thousands of people. This administration has actually worked to reunite children and families, successfully putting back together around 500 of them that were separated by the Trump administration, although 200 still remain lost to each other. In recent weeks, as a new wave of Venezuelans flee economic collapse at home, shelters and encampments in Mexico have begun to fill again. Even more, seemingly under pressure from Washington, rumor has had it that Mexican officials are pushing Venezuelans still further south across the border into Guatemala. And even as the Biden administration is engaged in lawsuits to end expulsions under Title 42, the public health measure that's been used to deport people since the COVID pandemic began without any semblance of an asylum process, it has recently expanded such expulsions again by using them against Venezuelans, just as it did months ago to Ukrainians. Above all, of course, what people need from the U.S. immigration system is a simple, efficient, and predictable pathway to citizenship, not the Byzantine, arbitrary, and capricious system we have now. Children and adults are crossing borders for any number of reasons, but these include, importantly, seeking to reunite after many decades of a racialized labor system in the United States that wants immigrant workers, but not their households. Not children, not elders. The ongoing disruptions of everyday life for impoverished people in Central America, Venezuela, and Mexico has produced an asylum crisis, and this includes the ways that the IMF, World Bank, and NGOs have methodically destroyed national governments in many nations in Central America, opening the door to corruption and to drug cartels taking over municipal governments and incorporating themselves as NGOs, building organizations that extend from Honduras to the U.S. Southwest, made much worse by state-sponsored violence in the aftermath of the U.S.-sponsored coup in Honduras in 2009 and contested elections in 2017. The ways opponents of the child separation policy organized both helped and hindered the effort to address these problems. The first thing we have to acknowledge is that there's nothing exceptional about taking children from their kin and caregivers. This has been a practice up and down the Americas for 4 centuries. targeting single mothers and others without heteronormative families, especially enslaved people and members of tribal nations. Treating child separation as remarkable in some ways kept us from actually stopping it, as it allowed the Trump administration to claim in 2019 that it was just taking children from parents who had been neglectful or who had a criminal history. We've not been good ever at addressing the ways these charges have a history in this country of being directed at Black and Indigenous communities in rebellion, and all the people Kathy Cohen identified as queer, the welfare mothers, the single moms, the unruly youth, and all those who are bad at nuclear families. In order to understand the Trump-era policy of taking children from asylum seekers and putting them in detention camps, we need to ask how Central Americans were made into the sorts of people who could be dispossessed of their children. How did it come to be in the spring of 2018 that immigration officials walked the bridge of the Americas between Juarez and Mexico and picked Central Americans out of crowds of people from every country, continent, and island that walked that sky bridge? Why were Central Americans in particular told that the United States was full and they could not cross? As one immigration activist said, "If you look indigenous or you look Central American, they will stop you. They never ask why you are coming. They just say they can't receive you." The policy didn't spring fully formed from the head of a Trump administration official in 2018. It had a history in the anti-communist civil wars of the latter part of the 20th century, when Central Americans first began losing their children to state terror. Latin Americans in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s saw child taking by those who sought to instantiate neoliberalism across the region through anti-communist rhetoric. There, in the space between Henry Kissinger and Ronald Reagan's America, fascist Spain, and Latin America's own autonomous nationalism, militarism, and right-wing Catholicism, increasingly paranoid anti-communist states sought to rigidly control not only the present, but the future. Military dictatorships up and down Latin America, from Guatemala to Argentina, directed campaigns of torture, assassination, and disappearance. While initially these right-wing military dictatorships targeted armed leftist guerrillas, their victims grew more diverse as they quickly overwhelmed and largely killed actual militants, turning to those who supported anything even vaguely socialist, from unions to students to agrarian cooperatives. Then they took their children, hoping to ensure that the very young who might have been touched by their parents' leftist ideas were violently uprooted and re-educated in conservative adoptive families or outside the country. This right-wing dream of killing ideas by burying their proponents and taking their children was a failure. As the extent of torture, and especially the kidnapping of children, became known to ever wider circles, there were first efforts to prosecute them. In 2006, Jorge Rafael Videla, once the most powerful man in Argentina as its military dictator, went to prison together with a number of his collaborators, not for his responsibility for torture, murder, and disappearances, but rather for kidnapping children and running an illegal adoption ring while he was the de facto president in the late 70s and early 80s. While the Argentine Congress had tried to grant a general amnesty to the former leaders to prevent their prosecution for the crimes they committed as they oversaw hundreds of torture centers, and while giving orders for the military to kill civilians, a judge found that the official pardon didn't cover child kidnapping because it was an ongoing crime, continuing after the final date of the amnesty. Kidnapped infants and children turned out to be the crime they could be prosecuted for, and it's what held them in prison until the amnesty was finally repealed in 2005. In El Salvador, in the late 1970s, more and more people despaired of free and fair elections as demonstrating for them got people killed, and they turned to support the leftist military guerrillas. In the U.S., the Carter administration to a small degree, and then the Reagan administration massively, gave a corrupt Salvadoran state support in the form of training for the military. They gave them weapons, military advisors, and ultimately about $1 to $2 million a day to prop up a brutal and unpopular government. The Salvadoran government held power through terror, detentions and disappearances, death squads that left bodies in the streets as a warning to others about opposing the government, and massacres of civilian communities that were suspected of support for the guerrillas. During the armed internal conflict, an estimated 75,000 civilians were killed in a country of only 5 million people. The overwhelming majority died at the hands of the military. Military and paramilitary forces in El Salvador also took between 800 and 1,000 children. During the conflict, the military sought to eliminate the social base of the guerrilla. Drawing on the U.S. military's paradigm in Vietnam, they sought to eliminate the water the fish of the guerrillas swam in, engaging in a scorched earth campaign against civilians, and creating model villages surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by military and paramilitary units in place of autonomous communities. Their goals included breaking people's will to resist by sowing terror, including of losing children, and as in Argentina, to control the future by refusing to allow those suspected of being communists from raising a next generation. Sometimes children became lost in the confusion when military threat forced communities to flee. Others were picked up right in front of their parents, and there were cases where they were literally ripped from their mother's arms. According to their reconstruction and research, from the stories of surviving relatives, human rights groups attributed 90% of the child disappearance cases to the military and 10% to the guerrillas. In late May and early June of 1982, to take only one example, in the events that became known as the Guinda de Mayo, the Flight in May, people ran from their homes because they were tipped off that paramilitary groups and the army were planning to come to their homes and kill them, believing that they were supporters of the guerrillas. The military called this Operation Cleanup, Operación Limpieza, designed to wipe out communities in northeast Chalatenango. People fled from one community to another with soldiers on their heels who killed anyone they found. They slaughtered animals and destroyed homes and crops. These forces also took at least 11 children, including Ernestina and Erlina Serrano Cruz, ages 3 and 7. When the Serrano Cruz family began running, the mother and a brother made it past the military barricade and went in one direction, while the father, brother, and sisters Suyapa, Ernestina, and Erlina went in another. After 3 days of walking, they made it to a settlement. They hid there for another 3 days without food or water, but finally the brothers went to search for water. Ernestina and Erlina, small children alone, began to cry, tipping off soldiers to their presence. Suyapa was not far away, but she had a 6-month-old baby, and she had tried to protect her family by hiding separately in case the baby cried. She later reported that she heard one soldier ask if they should take Ernestina and Erlina or kill them. Another replied that they should take them. When she no longer heard the soldiers, Suyapa went and searched for her sisters, but they were gone. The little girls were never found. After the war, a human rights group, La Asociación Pro Búsqueda de Niños y Niñas Desaparecidos, the Association for Searching for Disappeared Children, began the painful work with families of trying to find children disappeared during the war. They found about 500, some of them adopted in Europe, some in the United States, others in Salvador, and continued to look for others. While it took decades of work for their lawyers, the case that ultimately broke open the impunity surrounding the military child-taking was that of the Serrano Cruz girls. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled in 2005 that the state was responsible for their disappearances and demanded that it open its records to help find them and form a national search commission, which it did, albeit not until 6 years later. The court also found that the military unit that took the girls was the infamous Atlacatl Battalion, responsible for numerous massacres and atrocities during the war. This is particularly significant for the still unanswered question of whether U.S. military and intelligence advisors, widely believed to have trained Salvadorans in torture and responsible for their scorched earth strategy, were also involved with Salvador's child kidnapping policy. The Atlacatl Battalion was trained by the U.S. military in the School of the Americas in North Carolina and was directly advised by them once they returned to El Salvador. The New York Times called the battalion the pride of the United States military team in San Salvador. Even if U.S. advisors did not directly urge child-taking, and we don't know if they did or didn't, it's difficult to believe that they never heard anything about it. Some children were even living in military barracks, and every child who was adopted transnationally to the U.S. passed through the U.S. Embassy in San Salvador. As Robert White, U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador in 1980 and 81, said of the efforts to cover over the horrors of what the Salvadoran leadership and military was doing by the Reagan administration, and to a lesser extent the Bush and Carter administrations, the Salvadoran military knew that we knew, and they knew when we covered up the truth. It was a clear signal that, at a minimum, we tolerated this. If they knew and didn't speak against it, U.S. officials aided and abetted child-taking. Although Guatemala shares a border with El Salvador, they're quite different kinds of places, and the civil wars had very different dynamics. One could say that about the Central America region as a whole. In Nicaragua, the guerrillas won. In El Salvador, they almost won. In Guatemala, they had an uphill battle but were stopped by genocide when they were beginning to make progress. And in Honduras, in part due to the U.S. military presence, they never got off the ground. Guatemala, much larger than Salvador, and its people speak more than 20 different languages. About half are indigenous, many of whom live in remote communities in the highlands that are a day's walk from any road. If El Salvador is finally coming to a reckoning with child-taking in the 1980s, Guatemala's encounter with its Cold War horrors is still ongoing, and perhaps a losing battle. El Salvador has a relatively complete counting of the hundreds of children that were lost during the war, and many of them have been found. Guatemala lacks anything like a comprehensive account of the more than 5,000 children who were disappeared. There, a paranoid Ladino ruling class feared the autonomous, non-Spanish-speaking indigenous Mayan communities. Some, like the Ixil-speaking Maya of a remote region of the highlands, that's a picture of somebody in an Ixil community, were identified as a group as subversives, guerrilla sympathizers or worse, and targeted for elimination. While the military rulers denied it to the world, and most Guatemalans in the major urban areas tried to pretend it wasn't happening, the military committed atrocities and massacres in the highlands, slipping into communities in the early morning hours and killing everyone, destroying crops, killing animals, burning homes. They reveled in gruesome ways to end the life in a human body, whether of men, women, or children. They razed 440 communities with the intimate and extensive cooperation of U.S. military advisors and the CIA. Where they didn't assassinate, they captured people and disappeared children. The effects of taking small children and disappearing them are similar everywhere. The exquisite pain of the loss of a loved one compounded by the uncertainty of what happened to them, and the agony of having failed someone who was so deeply dependent on you. Here's a quote from somebody in Guatemala. My name is Feliciano Raimundo, and I remember that after they disappeared Jose in 1982, they killed my husband and disappeared my other sons. I became ill from the pure sorrow and suffering. During the following 18 years, I was able to find 3 of my sons, but I wasn't able to learn about my Jose. I don't know what happened. Sometimes I thought that maybe he had died, and other times I felt that he was alive. I always kept alive that hope, and I wondered, who does my son live with? Could he be married? Where would he be living? Other days, sadness would get the better of me, and I would think that it would have been better if I hadn't left him with someone in a place where she had thought he would have been safer. If I had done other things in those days, surely Jose would not have been lost. Survivors grieved without resolution. The armed forces and the paramilitaries in Guatemala did not kill all the children they picked up. They also took them to other indigenous communities for adoption or dropped them off at orphanages where they made their way to Europe or the United States in adoption sometimes, or took them to towns and cities. One of the tactics of the vast bureaucracy of the military and intelligence services, which effectively encircled the entire nation through its network of orejas, of informants and spies, was to pit indigenous peoples against each other. The goal of disappearing children was the logic of ideological and genocidal elimination, to disrupt the transmission of languages, ways of life, the practical arts of weaving huipils or blouses, to eliminate ways of thinking and acting. Sometimes, even during the war, people would learn that their children were still alive. But growing up in a community that spoke a different language and was loyal to the government. On the one hand, they spoke of it being a relief to find them alive, but they were also full of grief to find that their children were now in some sense also part of the enemy that might return to kill them and all their community. The peace accords were officially signed in 1996, but the civic process of building peace was never completed. The now grown children who were kidnapped are still searching for their families and communities, while parents and relatives keep looking for them. As elsewhere in Latin America, family members of los desaparecidos were a political force demanding that children who were taken alive be found. Unlike in El Salvador or Argentina, however, in Guatemala, the same people who were found responsible for acts of genocide by the truth commissions often stayed in power. 2 reports from the Archbishop's Commission on Human Rights, one in 1998, the other in 2000, collected testimony on, first, 216 children disappeared alive, and later then 444. This latter report, Hasta encontrarte, Until You Are Found, focused exclusively on disappeared children and suggested that there were many, many more cases. In 1999, a number of groups of relatives of the disappeared came together to begin the massive task of trying to reunite children with the families who lost them under the umbrella of Todos por el Reencuentro. By 2008, they had organized 650 reunions, bringing together translators, often more than one, since many monolingual speakers of indigenous languages were involved, and gathered the resources for the often long trips across the country on buses and on foot. These emotional reunions often brought out whole communities to celebrate, though the renewed connections were often fleeting in the face of the expense of travel and the absence of a shared language. While most of us know something, and many of us know a lot about Central America's wars and the U.S. sponsorship of them, now I want to talk about the more clandestine war, the part that was funded by drugs. The Reagan administration played a much bigger role than policy experts usually want to acknowledge in birthing the contemporary era of drug cartels and drug trafficking, although the general outlines were laid out in the Iran-Contra hearings and subsequently the Kerry Commission hearings on drugs and foreign policy. Obviously, part of this was just destroying the formal economy through war, so-called development loans, and bringing to power a ruling class that shrank the state and often did nothing to build healthcare, education, or food subsidies, leaving the informal economy, drugs in particular, as one of the few ways to make a buck. And literally in El Salvador, it's a buck, right? They're using U.S. currency. But also, when Congress cut off funding for the anti-communist wars in Central America, as it became clear that the kinds of militaries and paramilitaries that the Reagan administration was supporting were engaged in torture, disappearances, and bodies in the streets, and kidnapping children, a shadow U.S. government operation allowed them to fund themselves in shady ways, including flying bricks of cocaine into U.S. cities on military planes. Indeed, these networks are the origins of the current cartels that are terrorizing impoverished people, especially women and children throughout Central America and Mexico, and sometimes the U.S. as well, driving the current asylum crisis on the southwest border. The 1980s was also when children seeking refuge from Central America's wars who walked or got a ride across the U.S. border started being held in cages. Despite the Trump exceptionalism that led many to believe that child separation for asylum seekers was new, Central American children have been sent to detention camps and separated from their parents for decades. First, Mexico and secondarily Central America came in the 20th century to function as a kind of labor reserve for the United States. Agribusiness, service industries, and the construction sector, alongside employers of housekeepers and nannies, relied on being able to access a labor force that, under the shadow of deportation, could be expected to work cheaply and outside the system of labor protections, like minimum wage. In time of labor oversupply, these same workers could be pushed back into Latin America. In times of shortage, more could be recruited. The arrival of large numbers of children signaled the death of this tacit bargain, however. The deal was essentially that workers would not stay in the United States, although that was always a fantasy more than a reality. And employers and local communities would not pay the costs of reproducing the labor force. Children would stay in home countries to get educated, get their health care, and grow to an age where they could be of use as workers. When people became too old or disabled to work, they'd be forced back across the border. In this way, Latin America functioned like South Africa's homelands or Bantustans under apartheid, a reserve where women, children, and elders were expected to subsist off a workers' remittances or whatever farming they could scratch out. In the 1980s, the system began to falter in Central America as adults and children fled wars at home. Women became a larger and larger group of migrants, often bringing children across the border as well. By the 1990s, with the Bill Clinton-era militarization of the border, the system broke down even further, as workers could no longer return to home countries to birth or father children, renew relationships with children or partners, or visit elders as they were dying. By 2014, when Central American children started arriving unaccompanied in significant numbers, it was clear that the border militarization and deteriorating conditions of violence victimizing impoverished people in the region had completely destroyed the old system. Unaccompanied children actually began filing asylum petitions in numbers after 2000, claiming a human right to safety as drug cartels, police violence and impunity, economic collapse, and gangs threaten their well-being in order to continue to feed the apparently insatiable appetite for drugs in the United States. U.S. social policy continued to try to keep the old labor agreement in place. Its collapse was why conservatives and white nationalists were and are in a dead panic about small children crossing the border. As soon as there were significant numbers of Central Americans in the U.S. Southwest, there were children in detention camps and separated from their parents. Most sought to find relatives and disappear into the general population, which became easier as Central American immigrant communities grew. While many slipped across the border unnoticed, the unlucky ones were picked up by the INS. Between 7,400 and 8,500 children a year between 1987 and 1993. They were strip-searched, detained, and then usually released to parents or guardians to await hearings on immigration charges. They were also, for a time, large, sprawling Red Cross camps at the Texas-Mexico border that housed Central American families. In 1985, Jenny Lizette Flores was part of a group of children who were held for months or years as a result of new INS rules that prevented her release to a guardian. The INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, I just looked around and realized that some of you have only known it as ICE, decided it would only release children in custody to a mother, father, or grandparent, aunt, or uncle, and only if they could prove that they were in status in the United States. If Jenny Flores' mother had picked her up, she would essentially be turning herself in as an undocumented immigrant and become subject to deportation. Her husband had been killed in El Salvador, and this was not something she was willing to do. So instead, she turned to Carlos Holguin, an attorney with the National Center for Immigrant Rights. Holguin took the Reagan administration to court on immigrant child detention, the conditions under which children were held, and the question of whether they should be detained at all. He sought to get Jenny Flores released to a cousin, arguing that she was better off with him than in an old hotel that had been converted into an immigration detention facility, sharing a room with 3 adult male strangers, strip-searched, with no minimal standards enforced for health, sanitation, or access to education or age-appropriate diversions. The court and the INS proved much more willing to clean up the conditions of immigrant detention for children than to release them. The Flores case ultimately split into 3, one on strip searches, one on whether refugee and immigrant children could be detained at all, and one, subsequently, on the conditions of that detention in Flores v. Meese. In 1987, the Reagan administration tentatively agreed to safer and more humane conditions in detention, the Flores v. Meese Settlement Agreement. The Flores Agreement, which is still in force, supposedly, stipulated that children would only be held for a few days in the least restrictive setting, a licensed non-secure facility, to determine whether they should be deported or reunited with relatives. Otherwise, they would be placed in foster homes or licensed facilities with age-appropriate programs. The most important part of the Flores litigation, in my view, was the Supreme Court case to determine whether children should be put in immigration detention at all. The Reagan and first Bush administration aggressively defended the practice of holding about 2,000 children a year. They sought to keep detaining children even after the Ninth Circuit ruled that they had released them to relatives, appealing it to the Supreme Court in Barr v. Flores, and yes, that Barr, Bill Barr, also the Attorney General under Trump. In that case, the government's strategy was to defend detention by arguing it was humane and homelike. Advocates for migrant children painted a much different picture, citing 9 different child advocacy groups who testified to shackling, barbed wire, arbitrary punishment, inadequate food, lack of access to counsel or phones. One youth who was subsequently sent to juvenile hall in California described the vast improvement there over INS detention conditions. In 1993, by a 5-4 majority, the High Court ruled in favor of keeping children in detention, with Antonin Scalia writing for the majority that where the conditions of government custody are decent and humane, such custody surely does not violate the Constitution. In his dissent, Justice Stevens insisted that, on the contrary, jailing children for offenses that were legally as weighty as a parking ticket was obscene. During the Clinton years, little changed. About 200 children were being held in long-term immigrant detention at any given time, some of whom, though not all, had requested asylum. In 1997, a Human Rights Watch report damned the practice of jailing children, particularly those who were lawfully present in the U.S. because they had petitioned for asylum. It called on the INS to release children to relatives or child welfare agencies, to inform them of their legal rights, and to provide education and books in detention center. The report was embarrassing to the Clinton administration, and so it finally concluded the negotiations over the Flores settlement begun under Reagan. If children must be held, it would be under safe and sanitary conditions in a licensed child welfare facility, with access to food and water, medical care, adequate temperature control, and lawyers, and segregated from unrelated adults and young prisoners charged with crimes. Unfortunately, the Flores Agreement was never sufficient in itself to deter abuse by immigration officials. The George W. Bush administration detained small children with their parents and unaccompanied minors under far harsher conditions than the Clinton administration or even Reagan. Following the September 11, 2001 events, the Bush administration began separating children from parents for the first time, and parents from each other. Instead of family detention, they, like the Trump administration subsequently, created a legal fiction of these being unaccompanied children by virtue of having been separated from their caregivers by the INS, which is exactly what the Trump administration subsequently did. An Amnesty International report in 2003 called attention to these conditions, and they found the second Bush administration and Customs and Border Protection essentially ignored the Flores rules for child detention. According to Amnesty International, child migrants were spending years in detention without judicial review of their claims to stay in the U.S., strip searches had been reinstituted. They were housed with juveniles convicted of crimes, beaten by guards, and subjected to solitary confinement for infractions like poor sportsmanship, swearing, or even grammatical mistakes. Children as young as 7 were brought to immigration hearings in shackles with belly chains and leg irons. In 2005, the Congressional Appropriations Committee ordered the Bush administration to stop separating families, telling them to use ankle monitors to ensure parents appeared at their asylum hearings. Rather than release families, though, the Bush administration expanded family detention. Where the previous system had relied on a single small facility, the Berks Detention Center in Pennsylvania, the Bush administration opened a much larger one to hold more families, the T. Don Hutto Detention Center near Austin, Texas. It quickly became a symbol of the abusiveness of the system. A former medium security prison for men, it lacked the green space of Berks, a former nursing home that housed up to 84 people. And it was characterized by cells on long hallways with bars on the windows with capacity for more than 500. It was a dramatic change in the treatment of families seeking asylum who were lawfully present in the United States, who had previously usually been released into the community to await their hearings. At Hutto, children of refugees awaiting hearings on asylum claims were denied schooling, trapped all day in cells, either with unrelated adults or their parents, with no recreational facilities. They weren't even allowed crayons or pajamas. The ACLU and others filed lawsuits to stop the separation of children and other practices that it said were prohibited under Flores, resulting in a new settlement agreement, often again promising to minimize family detention and the separation of children and parents. Whoops. Oh, wait, I really do want that slide. So in 2020, and particularly with the COVID-19 crisis, the Trump administration began to actually accomplish what it had long set out to win, the effective unraveling of the asylum system put in place after World War II. First, they learned what the Obama administration understood all along, which was that legal and bureaucratic undermining of the system works better than making children cry in front of reporters and activists. Beginning in 2019, the Trump administration took children from their parents seeking asylum under the pretext that their parents were criminals. There's not much history in the U.S. of defending parents who've been criminalized, no matter how slight the crime, and the mass demonstrations in the street and persistent editorials stopped. Then they reactivated the Obama-era program of trying to stop asylum seekers in Mexico, Plan Frontera Sur. Officially, ICE gave some people their due, their right to an asylum hearing, but metered their crossing into the United States, then sent them back across the border into Mexico to live in UN-funded refugee shelters in tent cities to await hearings that never came in the midst of the dangerous landscapes of the border region, where many were victimized again by the same transnational mafias and cartels that they had fled in Central America. With the COVID crisis, even these limited forms of access to refugee hearings were reduced to the merest trickle. Border Patrol agents were ordered to deport essentially any non-citizen found near the border, including children under Title 42 of the Public Health Code. Claiming that their goal was to avoid exposing asylum seekers to COVID in congregate settings, ICE essentially suspended the asylum system. And we will continue to need an asylum system, or something like it, to address the aftermath of wars in Central America. Decades of intervention by international financial institutions and non-governmental organizations that shrunk and replaced the functions of federal government in Central America have, by design, dramatically weakened Central American states in order to promote free markets. Power abhors a vacuum, and the cartels rushed in. Local officials, the police, gangs, and international crime syndicates increasingly became the same entities, often with the endorsement and support of the Trump administration during his presidency. Murder rates for impoverished people at the hands of all these groups skyrocketed as they were increasingly forced to pay for protection to drive a taxi or run a store. People of humble means, particularly women, queer and trans folk, youth and children, fled in droves, seeking asylum in the United States and Mexico. I want to conclude by way of this image of a protest at Fort Sill, where the Trump administration sought to house 1,600 migrant children. Fort Sill began as a POW camp during the Indian Wars, where the Apache leader Geronimo died. A century later, it housed Japanese-American detainees during World War II. This group, pictured here, a coalition of members of the Movement for Black Lives, Japanese, Jewish, and Native activists, stopped it from becoming a detention facility for migrant children. As we watch as the Biden administration tries to figure out whether it will continue to expel thousands of people, and it is, or honor its campaign promise to listen to what the majority of people in the United States actually want, which is increased migration, a just, rapid asylum system, and a pathway to citizenship rather than a racialized labor system that consigns some people to exploitative jobs and fields and people's homes, threatened always with the risk of losing their children in order to keep them in line. We need to honor the history of protest against child taking and remember that people in every generation have stood against it. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Laura, are you happy to take questions?
More than happy to take questions.
Hello. Great. Thank you so much, Professor. This is great. I have a question, I guess, I would love to hear your thoughts on the racialization, like the history of the racialization of families, and also the racialization of the border, and how this episode of Zero Tolerance, family separation, is where those two histories sort of intersect, and if there have been moments in the past. Your lecture speaks to that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit more on that. Yeah.
Thank you. So the family has always been a technology of racialization in the United States. It's remarkable, given all the counter evidence in front of us every day, that we imagine families to be a site where people are racially homogeneous, right? And the other thing that we do with the family is to see all non-nuclear families as potentially also non-white. And we know this through the image of a figure like the welfare queen and her kin, who also turns up as sort of the anti-hero of the culture of poverty narrative, the figure that centers overpopulation, which we were recently reminded in the El Paso shooting is still very much a live fantasy of white nationalists. Obviously, eugenics in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was a fierce account of racialization, not just of people of color, especially earlier in the 20th century, but also of white folks, of trying to produce a healthy and pure white family, right, without visible signs of disability. So I've always been interested in how we live the context of empire from inside families, how we live the context of racialization, how we live the context of the economy from within families. And one of the things that so fascinated me about what Celeste Ng did in Our Missing Hearts, which I mentioned at the outset, is that she manages to tell the story of a dystopic white nationalist future from inside families. And so the question of how we encounter borders and bordering, I think not just in the U.S. and the Southwest, but as also a site where we think family, is quite interesting to me and horrifying as I sort of pursue these questions. So we remember the Reagan era as the era of traditional values and anti-gay stuff and fears about single mothers, and seeing that play out also as punishing immigrant families who could not produce themselves as nuclear, right? That only certain people could pick up a child from immigration detention. and they had to be a pretty near approximation of the nuclear family, not a cousin, for example. And we have a long history, too, of encountering in the United States, the encounter between tribal nations and U.S. racism has long been in terms of the problem of understanding a tribal community as not composed of nuclear families. And over again, seeing it sexualized and racialized and turned into an object of war through specifically thinking about patterns of sexuality and family making. And of course, the history of enslavement is the history of telling us that, of slavers telling the story that black mothers had no feelings for their children, and that's why they could be sold apart. So that's a really long answer to your question.
Do you want me to stand or can I sit? Hi. So I had a question, and maybe a little bit outside of I don't know, maybe related more than I think. But so recently there have been like all these new technologies through which some of these children now as adults have tried to reclaim those connections. And I'm thinking of in Argentina,
Yep.
of all the children who disappear, DNA and all of that. Can you just talk about what you've encountered in what you've read about that and your thoughts on it?
Sure. So, you know, it's a transnational effort by Physicians for Human Rights to actually develop technology that would allow them to transform what, in the 80s we had good technology for being able to identify through DNA who was your child, right? That's still the only thing DNA, by the way, is really good at. All the stuff where people tell you you can send your DNA to some bank and they'll tell you what your ethnicity is. That's not what DNA is good for. However, those banks are collecting tons and tons of information that is being used by law enforcement to tell stories about families and relations. And so to try to solve crimes through identifying, oh, it must be this person's son, this person's half-brother. But so what Physicians for Human Rights sought to do was to figure out if you could identify the grandmother of somebody, particularly because it was groups identifying as grandmothers that were at the forefront of the activism to recover Argentina's lost children. And indeed, they began to be able to trace out those relationships. And, you know, it was an amazing effort that brought together people in the U.S., people in Argentina, and people throughout Latin America who developed these technologies together. So one of the things that feels particularly grim to me in the United States right now is how difficult it feels to find sources of opposition to the growing white nationalism. And so, and the fascinating thing is everybody, this is a side note, sorry, but everybody keeps talking about, oh, we have to think about Hungary and Poland. And sure, we can think about Hungary and Poland, but it's as if we don't live in the hemisphere of the Americas. Like, it's as if we don't know how much these ideologies were developed for the U.S. ruling class in relationship to Latin America. Even this anti-trans stuff, people are like, oh my God, it's just like Hungary. No, oh my God, it's just like Colombia. Oh my God, it's just like Latin America. And these people know each other. These people are often related to each other. Anyway, so it's important to me to stay in touch with Latin American activists who have faced all of this for decades with tremendous resources and tremendous courage. And even as, I don't mean to be flip about this, but we don't get killed much in demonstrations, and they do. And I think they've faced much harsher conditions than we have for their activism, with much greater courage than, in general, people in the United States have expressed. And that's not to minimize, actually, the sheer level of violence that people encountered in the summer of 2020 in the Black Lives Matter protests, which I still think we don't have a full... I mean, we have the reports that tell us that story, but we don't have that as a shared narrative, that people were hurt and killed regularly in those demonstrations by the police. But by and large, those kinds of experiences are more the exception than the rule in how protest has been treated in the United States compared to how it's been treated in Latin America.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk, even though you are telling a very horrific and outraging story. I was just wondering, what about the families that have adopted these children? Are they... do they know what were the conditions that allowed them to adopt? And are they openly or consciously complicit with this story? Or what's the story there?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I went back and forth about whether to talk about it in the talk. So when I was in El Salvador talking to the lawyers and the researchers at Pro Búsqueda, they talked about what it meant to contact families in the United States. And for the obviously, humans are incredibly diverse, and there are many different experiences. For example, I'm not thinking of her name. The title of her book is Missing Mila. One adoptive parent of a Salvadoran kid actually reached out to the family in Salvador and Honduras and fully acknowledged what was her kid's kind of difficult to understand account of that. And she very much had, or he very much had parents alive in El Salvador, and relatives alive in El Salvador. And we also know the story from the film Discovering Dominga of a Guatemalan young person whose sister was a missionary. And, so had good Spanish and a lot of knowledge of Guatemala. And as Dominga kept talking about her experiences and what she knew, her sister was able to find her her community and her surviving relatives. So I say that as scaffolding to say what the lawyers at Pro Búsqueda told me is that the overwhelming majority of U.S. families don't even want to acknowledge what happened. And only a handful of them are willing to have contact. I've been starting to think more and more about how foster care was built as such a homophobic and transphobic institution, why it's one of the most explicitly homophobic and transphobic wings of the state. And I think it's related to why people may be really bad at figuring out a relationship to these imperial relations, which is to say that evangelical Christians have embraced adoption, embraced transnational adoption, so have Mormons, but they've embraced it within a particular narrative of exclusivity. And while that's certainly not all the people who are involved in transnational adoption, it's a disproportionate number of them. And while sometimes the experience of understanding the ways, and this is what I keep thinking about and why I keep writing about it, the ways that the insides of families become complicit in U.S. empire, sometimes that's quite disturbing and provocative to people in the U.S. or Europe. But for the most part, all the energy that goes into disavowing U.S. empire in general is replicated by families.
Hi, I'm a history PhD student, and I've noticed in the last several years in that discipline, there's been a move towards using liberalism as a framework for critiquing, some of the systems of society that we least like.
Can you talk more?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm losing you.
Sorry. For example, like there are some scholars who argue, like carcerality is a symptom of liberalism in the liberal state. Of course, the challenge with that argument is that there's non-liberal states that are extremely carceral, like China and Russia, for example. And so I'm just curious if you think that liberalism is a useful framework for criticizing the issues that you've raised. Is taking children something that liberal regimes do, and that's the right entry point for thinking about these things, or is that too limiting?
As I was giving this talk, I kind of tripped over the part where I said, we need a good asylum system. Because the other way to say it is we need to abolish the distinction between immigrants and asylum seekers. And that, it seems to me, is closer to certainly much closer to what I hope for, but it seems further away. And so that's not what I said, or that's not what I wrote. And it seems to me that encapsulates the problem with using liberalism right there, right? Liberalism is a widely shared framework that we can use to develop certain kinds of arguments that are useful to certain people. But at the end of the day, it's also the problem, right? And so I think when you raise the issue of carcerality, that's precisely the point, that liberalism with its relationship to capitalism and its relationship to a certain account of the family gives us this system. And so everyone's always an exception in liberalism, right? And we've seen the asylum and immigration systems very much operate within the system. As it used to be that people who were approved for asylum were approved in blocks, right? Cambodians were, because what we understood was that people belonged to a common situation. And what, I'm now stumbling because I don't want to, what conservatives operating within capital L liberalism understood is that liberalism's genius is to turn everybody into an individual over and over and over again. Not even right there. What was I wanted to? I'm thinking about Thatcher saying, right? There are no groups. There are only family. There are individuals and their families. And one of the things that fascinates me about that line is, so just to finish out the previous thought. So now, zillions of lawyers have to be deployed to each and every single asylum case, each and every immigration case. And there are never going to be enough of us. There are never enough expert witnesses. It's just, we've lost, right? Once everybody becomes an individual. And not that one shouldn't care about those individuals, of course, but and their stories, but that this is how the system made it so exceptional that asylum seekers would be granted asylum, that people would be approved as refugees, that people would be approved for an immigration visa. But the other thing that's fascinating about the Thatcher line is how much our households are important to liberalism. And I could say a lot about that, and I'm going to try not to. But the ways that we are embedded in households only as nuclear families, right? Only nuclear families count, is another way of exceptionalizing all sorts of people. And indeed, the majority of people in the world are not in nuclear families. It's ridiculous. So anyway, individuals and their families is how liberalism operates.
Laura, I wanted just to follow up on that. You're part of your title of your talk is about tactics of terror, and it strikes me that you've put a lot of focus today in the actual talk about the terror throughout Latin America, much of it related to U.S. empire. In the book, you also talk about terror tactics against particular racialized communities within the United States that you didn't focus as much attention on here: Native, Black, Latino, and others. And I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about that now. It may relate to this question of individuation and family, or it may say something else about the treatment of people as groups at moments of emerging political influence or radical threat. But
yes, thank you for that question. So the thing I've been trying to argue, or the thing I tried to argue in the book, is that what we can see is the use of the tactic of taking children is that it has, that it's always a political tactic. It is actually not about individuals. And so I talk about the civil rights movement and the moment of the explosion of the size of the foster care system being in the context of school desegregation. And so at the very moment that Black communities are using as a strategy to sort of present themselves in their Sunday best in demonstrations as respectable people deserving of citizenship and respect, the tactic of white supremacists was to paint them as disreputable, particularly to focus on single mothers and their children. And so using welfare as cutting off welfare was a strategy to crush support for civil rights or terrorize communities. And that in turn became a way of separating children from their parents by basically starving single mothers and their children. And then the community would say, well, you can't take care of your child. And so that child should be placed in foster care. And the federal government actually pioneered that strategy in conversation with southern states. I also talk about the ways that a certain kind of abortion politics were pioneered in relationship to the so-called war on drugs. And so the accusation that pregnant women were using drugs, or especially in Native communities that pregnant women were drinking excessively, both of these were it bears saying, lies. I want to say as often as I can, because it so still is troubling, cocaine has no effect on a pregnancy. This hysteria about crack babies was entirely ginned up. And but what prosecutors were doing, ambitious anti-abortion prosecutors were doing, was trying to produce an account of fetal personhood that we now see running rampant through the land as an account of why women can't have autonomy, women and trans folks can't have autonomy over their bodies, even if there's a 6-week fetus the size of a lentil inside it. If you're carrying around a person inside your body, you become subject to the protection of that person by the state. And that was always the point. And sometimes people ask me, well, so why was the state trying to save, producing this rhetoric about saving Black babies and saving Native babies? And it seems to me that it never particularly cared about saving Black babies or saving Native babies so much as it cared about using, depriving Black and Native women of rights and sending them to prison and jail for being pregnant as a sort of trial run for how to push anti-abortion politics in the United States. And I talk also about the fights for the Indian Child Welfare Act and laws to limit, or not laws, but policies to limit the placement of Black foster kids in white adoptive homes, and the fights against those in the 1990s. And still, the Fifth Circuit just handed down a decision that seems to threaten the Indian Child Welfare Act. And, you know, I want to say that's so crazy. Like, you can't do that, right? The claim that what the Indian Child Welfare Act does is produce Native people as a racial group, and that's improper. It does no such thing. It produces Native people as members of a particular polity, as members of tribal nations. It's very explicit about that. But what the last few years have taught me is to stop believing that crazy shit doesn't happen in the courts. Sorry, I couldn't get through that sentence without the curse, but so that's some of the rest of it. I point out what I think we don't say enough, which is Indian boarding schools were started by the War Department. They were started as a strategy to address Indian wars. They were meant to terrorize people. And then they were subsequently supplemented with religious schools by the Catholic Church, the Mormons, and other Christian groups. But, you know, it's important to remember that, like, Carlisle Indian School, most famous of Indian schools, what is it now? It's it's an Army War College. It never stopped being a military facility. And in fact, the legal basis under which Trump could give an executive order for asylum seekers to lose their kids at the border without being legally challenged was precisely the same basis under which the Indian boarding schools were enacted as federal policy. So these things are very much tied up with each other, and we are still living their legacy. Queer families are losing their kids again. They always were. But it was, for a time, Black and Latinx queer families that were mostly losing their kids. And now it's, you know, very white, middle-class parents in Texas of trans kids who are saying, wait, I'm the sort of person you want to be a foster parent. Sorry, there are people I follow on Twitter, and I'm like, please stop. Please don't do that. But, you find, but it's actually fascinating to find coalitions in Texas between the anti-carceral activists who want to end what they call the family regulation system and the foster care system with very conservative evangelicals who want to homeschool their kids without interference from the state. And together with them are these middle-class parents of trans kids. So the state will ultimately come after an awful lot of people, and perhaps there's some hope in that we can build meaningful coalitions like that one, but also others to stop the taking of children.
Hey, I was really curious to know about child taking in Honduras.
Child taking in
Honduras. And also, if you could talk a little bit about why in El Salvador there were more cases of recovering children than in some of the other countries. If you could just talk a little bit more about why that could be.
Civil society. The ability to build a civil society group that could reach across the whole country. And everybody in El Salvador, more or less, speaks Spanish. And the also the fact that I'm trying to think of a word that does some justice. The very conservative military members and members of the dictatorship stayed in power in Guatemala, and so it was extremely difficult to build anything in Guatemala that couldn't immediately be torn apart. I also think that the depth of people's fears of each other in Guatemala is, especially as indigenous communities were pitted against each other, remains a really salient thing. The other thing is human rights activists are still getting killed by the police and the military in Guatemala. If you want to do this work, you're facing imprisonment or death. I started doing research in Guatemala about the time that somebody in gender studies at the University of Central America got disappeared for doing this research. And I was like, oh. And, you know, hoping that having the protections of sort of a U.S. embassy, which we knew was complicit, but nevertheless, having the kind of the thing about being white and U.S. American gave me some protection, but it didn't for everybody. So it's complicated.
Laura, thank you so much. You've given me so much to think about. I want to think with you and just ask you to talk a little bit more about the status of the child in these different forms of child taking. And I'm struck that in that narrative about the making sure that when you take the child, you are canceling the future, right? And it seems to me that what is also the present right now is we're also living through all of these other, you not only have these cases of actual taking, right, and the loss, but that the law has made it, and the exercise of law enforcement has also been a way of holding us in a process of a lot of other kinds of child taking or child taking in potential. And I was thinking about the TPS debates that are happening right now, and how that is a slowly unfurling process of family separation. I was on a call this morning because I'm giving testimony for a asylum case for an Honduran family, a woman, and she will likely be deported because her 4 kids now have individually gotten asylum papers. And so the judge has decided that because those kids are safe, ostensibly safe, they're going to go into foster care, she can be deported. And so in some cases of what you were looking at, the child is the direct target of violence, just they themselves. Like when we put kids in lockup with adults and say they're MS-13 and they're animals, doesn't matter that they're 11, doesn't matter that they're 13. Sometimes it's to hold the parents hostage. But in so many of these cases, the cases of genocide and Guatemala, the killing of political enemies, I just want to ask you just sort of how you think about the different statuses of the child in those different acts of child taking, because one of the things that your study shows us is just how extraordinarily flexible this form of terror is and how just it weaves itself through the society, and then the cartels reproduce the child taking in their own operations. I'm just really inviting you to say more because it's so powerful what you've been sharing. Thank you.
I know one of the things I've thought a lot about is, or maybe not enough about, is that I'm actually much better at thinking about the ways that child separation is about the adults. And I think in that I am following so many of the policymakers and ideologues who are producing the rationale for child taking. But at the same time, it's really clear that it's not like once they get the child, then they imagine a humane future for the child, right? On the contrary, they imagine that gay kids will go through conversion therapy, that trans kids will not transition. They imagine that Spanish-speaking kids will be placed with Anglo families who don't speak Spanish. There were some people commenting from the Trump administration. I was really trying to figure out, like, what were they thinking? And so to some extent they were like, I don't know, I guess we just thought they'd go to DHS and like, no, and, they'd disappear. And like, there was no way to imagine children. And I always sort of like want to vomit when I think about Scalia and conservatives claiming that children in immigration detention, there was so much visceral testimony that I didn't want to quote, right? It's horrible. And I don't want to sort of produce the trauma. But that they then turned around and said, well, of course it's fine to detain children as long as the conditions are humane, and obviously they are. And, like, how? Like, how do you even sort of say that? So part of what's always fascinated me is the vanishing of children, like the imagination that they will, be produced as, I don't know, little white Americans or something. But it's, and this, the story you tell from this morning, I wish I could say it surprises me at all. There was a moment, of course, as we all know, when having children was a reason to stay, because it was cruel to children to leave them, to separate them from their parents.
Or their civil rights.
Right.
Meant that they were entitled to claim their parents.
And it's been now decades and decades of you can do anything you want to parents if you can produce any account at all in which the children are sort of okay. And it used to make me want to bang my head against a wall when I'd hear conservatives start talking about anchor babies at precisely the moment when there was no such thing anymore, right? It's like, how does this... So anyway, you've reached the level at which I'm completely incoherent and speechless. I don't know how to...
Laura, to the contrary, you've been incredibly coherent and, given us a lot to dwell on. And I want to thank you for your book, which I know many people have read and would urge everyone to read. And thank you for being here. And I know you'll be seeing some people tomorrow as well during your stay on campus, so we're grateful for that as well. And thank you to everybody who made this event possible. Please join me in thanking Laura Briggs. Thanks.